The Holy Gospel according to John, the 11th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When Jesus had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
The dead man came out of the tomb, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Now, even though I went to seminary, I am not an expert on ancient burial practices, but I saw a mummy in a museum one time. That helps, right? So I imagine that the way you see the mummies in the museum, the way they are bound and wrapped with cloth, is probably slightly different than the way your average grave cloths were placed on your average dead body. You know, there wasn't as much care and attention. But still, when I hear this story of Lazarus being awakened from death and called out of the tomb, when John tells us that Lazarus comes out of the tomb with his hands and feet bound and his face wrapped in a cloth, I can't help picturing him wound and bound as tightly as a mummy. You know, his legs wrapped together, his arms bound by his sides, bound so tightly that the only way he can come out of the tomb is by hopping. Do you ever think about that? Jesus is standing there, rolls his eyes. "Just somebody unbind him, please." Well, I do that, you know. When I'm faced with something that I don't want to deal with, something as big as death or grief or brokenness, despair, or anger, or sadness, my inner defense is to turn to humor. People who know me really well will tell you that instead of dealing with something head on, I might crack a joke or try to distract us from the situation. I'm getting better at it, though. But I bet the same might be true for some of you here as well, turning to humor when things are heavy. Or others here, when dealing with major life-changing events, might find yourselves endlessly weeping, or yelling or bargaining with God, or shutting off completely, or any other number of defenses. Or more realistically, for most of us, it's probably all of the above, right? One reaction after another, starting over again and again. Sometimes we have the option or the privilege of simply ignoring major things that happen around us, but death doesn't go away. Death is pervasive, obtrusive. No amount of hiding can make us immune from death. I always think about this statistic of 100%. 100% of us will deal with death at some point in our lifetime. And 100% of us will someday die. Death is one of the biggest enemies we face in this world. I think all of us have had that moment where we've cried out to God, unbind us and let us go, free us from this grip that death has on us. I also believe a piece of us questions whether or not God can or actually would do that for us. And that's why I struggle with this gospel story. It's why I think that this gospel story can actually bring more questions than answers. What were you thinking as you heard it? I wonder, why didn't Jesus hurry when his friends called to him for help? What were his disciples thinking when they witnessed him raise Lazarus from the dead? What were the crowds experiencing in that moment? What were Mary and Martha thinking? What was Lazarus thinking when suddenly he's awake and alive after being dead for 4 days? Why did Jesus cry? What does Jesus mean when he's talking with God and wanting the crowds to overhear? I have so many questions about this story in general, but on a day like today, one of my biggest questions is, how is this story even helpful? I mean, here we are remembering those in our church who have died this past year and those in our lives who have gone before us throughout the past. Here we are sharing our grief and lament, lighting candles to try and signify some bit of hope within us and around us. Here we are, most likely with this underlying question of why our loved ones have to die in the first place. And in the midst of all of that, the gospel story we hear is Jesus bringing someone back from the dead. How did Lazarus and his friends and family get so lucky? Why can't Jesus bring one of our family members back from the dead? God, unbind us and let us go. Free us from this burden of death. Free us from how it can take so much from us. But then we look around, and on a day like today, we are reminded that we are supposed to name the reality of death. And we are reminded that we are supposed to name the reality that God is with us in that death. In the past few years, I have really grown to appreciate and find very important this opportunity to talk about the reality of death in our lives. For those of you who were around here in St. Paul's in 2019, do you remember that series we did? Called it The Ministry of Graceful Endings. It was centered in the work we were doing around calling at the time. And in it, we were reminded how God calls us not only in how we live, but also how God calls us in how we die. So we hosted different sessions on how we can faithfully talk about death, raise it with our family and friends, and make plans and preparations for that time. We got a lot of the way through it before 2020 and the start of the pandemic, where we really did have to deal with suffering and death in the world. So we never really got to finish it. But it gave us another opportunity that led us to talk more about grief and loneliness and where we can find hope in all of this. Maybe we can continue that work someday. But back to that gospel story, with as many questions as it seems to bring, I do believe this story also brings a word of hope. When Mary and the crowds begin weeping, Jesus asks to accompany them. He said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus does. He goes with them to the tomb. And as they go on their way to the tomb, we hear the shortest and what some believe is one of the most powerful verses in the Bible. The verse that says, Jesus began to weep. Why would the Son of God weep? It shows us that Jesus is never beyond the misery of this world. Even Jesus feels the despair that can isolate us. And as we and the crowds will soon see with our very own eyes, even Jesus is not beyond the reach of suffering and death. But then in the story, this amazing thing happens. Jesus does something that points all of us to this reality of the kingdom of God. The reality that nothing, not misery or sorrow, not obstacles or stench or pain, not even death, nothing will be victorious over the reign of God. In the face of death, one of the biggest enemies of the world, even Jesus can speak words of life and resurrection. Lazarus, come out. Unbind him and let him go. I wonder what that means, though. Unbind him and let him go. I mean, sure, part of it was that command to take the grave cloths off of him so he can stop hopping. But then I also wonder if Jesus was speaking to unbinding the defenses that we put up so that we can try and stay far away from death. Or maybe Jesus was speaking to the crowds who were gathered around Lazarus, telling them that they should be unbound and freed from their doubts and disbelief that nothing can overcome death and the grave. Or maybe Jesus was speaking to death itself, that death can be unbound, and that death does not hold the final word over us. In reality, I imagine he's speaking to all of those things. We can finally be unbound and let go. That's the good news we hear in Revelation, but also in the words of the prophet Isaiah, that there is this banquet, a feast to celebrate what God has accomplished. You know, in other places in the Old Testament, as leading up to Isaiah, death is talked of as something that swallows up humanity. So for the prophet to say that that God is going to be swallowing up death forever, that's something important. But yet it's sometimes hard to believe that promise. It's hard to see resurrection in life when there is literal death in front of us. It can be hard to believe in the good news when Jesus isn't raising our loved ones from the grave. But that's why we're meant to hear these stories in our worship. That's why we gather, to remember the saints who surround us. As we've been doing for a few years now, we will soon hear the names of our friends and loved ones as we gather for communion, as a witness that those loved ones are living out that promise with God here and now. We will soon share in the mystery of that meal and this time, proclaiming that through the resurrection of Jesus, death does not have to be our enemy any longer. And we will be invited to light candles to show that even the smallest amount of light can overshadow the darkness of the grave and shine a little hope into this world. So we gather today and every day in the promise that as we are united with Jesus through our baptisms into his death, we too will awake from death. We too will be unbound and set free now and in eternity in order to give glory to the God who overcomes all things, even death. Amen.